If you're anything like me, you recognize that the real War Thunder late game isn't the new fancy shiny toys that come out every patch, or going back to earlier tiers to bully new players. To me, the War Thunder endgame is the custom battle community, specifically pilotage. This MAC is a non-violence game mode with a focus on player aerobatics. Pilotage has remained largely unchanged for 90% of its existence, leading players to invent new ways to have fun with the game that doesn't involve outright violence, such as single-plane or multi-aircraft aerobatics, huge aircraft formations, new ways to duel other players, or, the focus of this video, racing. River racing is a staple of the pilotage community. Metaplanes have come and gone, and before embarking on this study, I felt as if I had a strong grasp on what aircraft would and would not be great racers. But every time I thought I had a strong contender, a new player would come in with a new idea, a new plane, and destroy the competition. So I took it upon myself to rank every super prop in the game, and now you would truly know the best race plane in the entire game. Let me deconstruct the rules and regulations for this study before I get into the data. Every single aircraft in this study is a least performance SPA dead, i.e. the vehicle has all the performance modifications at the bare minimum. Second, each vehicle got 10 tests, 5 with MEC and 5 with AEC, or MEC and AEC. AEC, or automatic engine control, is the default game setting. An algorithm will decide the best parameters to set the engine of any given aircraft for any given speed, altitude, and desired power output. MEC, or manual engine control, is a special setting the player has to opt into in the controls menu, allowing the player to set engine parameters themselves without game interference. Why does this matter? The most important parameter, the one that brings in the most added performance, is radiator cooling percent, and is visually modeled as some variation of cowl flaps on all aircraft. Opening up the cowl flaps brings on more aerodynamic drag. Keeping them down gets rid of that drag. AEC on some planes, like Corsairs or Thunderbolts, have their cowl flaps constantly open to vent out excess heat, and while this is good, allowing the aircraft to wet for longer, the amount of drag this creates holds the aircraft's top speed and acceleration back a considerable amount. By using MEC, the player can lower the cowl flaps and retain some of their acceleration and top speed for a longer portion of the race at the risk of burning up their engine. So in essence, the pilot is balancing power and drag to get the best results. Another aspect of MEC is prop pitch percent and mixture percent. All piston props in this study have variable pitch propellers, meaning the angle of attack on the propeller blade can change. Though this isn't visually modeled, it still works. A shallower angle of attack requires the least torque, but the highest RPM, because the propeller is not moving very much air with each revolution. This is similar to a car operating in low gear. When the motorist reaches cruising speed, they will slow down the engine by shifting into a higher gear, while still producing enough power to keep the vehicle moving. This is accomplished in an airplane by increasing the angle of attack of the propeller. This means that the propeller moves more air per revolution and allows the engine to spin slower while moving an equivalent volume of air, thus maintaining velocity. In some aircraft, anything German, the increased prop pitch percent also drastically increases the temperature of the engine. This is because the engine has to work harder to move a larger volume of air and maintain sufficient RPM. So in turn, the engine either can't operate at WEP and high throttle settings, or it can't operate at high prop pitch angles. For this study, every plane whose engine wouldn't explode on 100% prop pitch was set to 100% prop pitch. German aircraft have a tendency to explode on max power plus max prop pitch, so in order to avoid that, they were raced with significantly lower prop pitch percent. From Messerschmitts they were set to 50%, and for Focke-Wulfs they could be set to 60%. While testing German aircraft, I was definitely riding the line between blowing up my engine and attempting to extract the most power out of it. If these aircraft were allowed to use 100% prop pitch, would they have been number one instead? It's hard to say, and while it is a bummer they are handicapped in this manner, it's not like they aren't competitive. The last part of MEC is mixture control, and it's difficult to say if this parameter has any meaningful impact on the study. Most planes don't have access to mixture control. It's really only a feature on these aircraft. Don't get me wrong, mixture control is very important for the aircraft that do have it. If set incorrectly at higher altitudes, the engine could stall, or if set too low at lower altitudes, the engine could have reduced power output. For this study, all aircraft that had access to mixture control are set to 120% to get the most power out of this setting. Lastly, the race route is fairly simple. In a typical public lobby, players would either gather at the Duisburg or Dusseldorf airports. For the purpose of this study, the pilot was spawned at the Point Air Spawn for Essen Airfield to speed up the testing process. I did not climb after spawning. I stayed at altitude, flew over the rock pier at Bridge 1. Devon turned into the race, starting the timer the moment I passed over the bridge pier. This ensured I wasn't going too fast into the first turn of the race. Before testing began for each plane, I would first spawn at Duisburg and fly in a straight line to the first turn of the race to gauge the maximum speed the given aircraft could accomplish, ensuring in each subsequent lap that the aircraft wouldn't exceed this maximum straight line speed. The results of this study are still accurate for each aircraft. Race rules. The pilot must stay between the trees on either side of the river. The pilot does not have to fly under any or all bridges. For AC, the moment the engine temperature numbers start flashing red, the player must pull off WEP. Allow the engine to cool to yellow numbers before putting on WEP again. For MEC, the pilot must keep the engine out of flashing red numbers for as long as possible before releasing WEP should it be necessary. Only when passing the final bridge are players allowed to ignore engine temperature cooling restrictions. The race starts when Bridge 1 has been passed and ends when the MAC border floods you around. Disqualifiers: overrunning a corner or cutting corners, smacking a tree, or otherwise having any lasting damage done to the airframe, not finishing the race due to engine overheating. I'll have a link to the spreadsheet in the description. The first page of the spreadsheet is the raw data from each test and the average time for both MEC and AEC. The second and third pages are both ordered lists, with the best planes being on top and the worst being on bottom. Fourth page is the map with important landmarks marked. Lastly, for the lists, each plane has a colored box next to each vehicle. That color represents the nation that plane is from according to the colors assigned to each nation from the raw data sheet. Some planes have multiple colors, meaning that vehicles can be found in multiple tech trees. The video you are seeing now all started at the same time as each aircraft passed over my official start line for this study. Each plane in these clips took off from Duisburg Airport and beelined it here, maximizing starting speed into the first corner. This is the straightest line in the whole race, so obviously it's most important that I go in at the maximum possible speed for every aircraft. The first corner is mild. Every plane can take it as sharp as they want and will only lose a small fraction of their total speed. It's not until the first hairpin and going under the first bridge that major inferences can be taken into each aircraft's overall performance. The Tempest and Bearcat are at least by the numbers. Neck and neck, they each have the same entering speed after the chicane, but it's the Tempest and the Yak that actually have the power to wait to overcome their losses. Throughout the first third of this race, you see that the clips are lined up in order of rank in my study. According to my MEC list, these are the top 3 racers. Each one is fully spay-dead, taking the minimum fuel load and no ordnance. The percentages at the bottom left of each clip is me deciding how much cooling percent and therefore how much drag is being induced on the aircraft. On the Tempest, the cowl flaps don't affect performance that much. On the Yak and the Bearcat they can. It's not until the run-up into the third hairpin that the lack of top-end acceleration on the Bearcat starts to show itself. Don't get me wrong, it's still good, but the Yak 3 gets the better of the Bearcat. So after this hairpin, the clips will no longer be in a clean order. What the Bearcat does have over the Yak 3 for this race is top speed, which is why it was ahead towards the beginning of the race. But after a few corners, here we are. A rule of thumb I made for this study is for the AEC tests, the racers have to pull off of wet if the temperature numbers are flashing red. This means the engine is in imminent danger of melting down. For MEC, however, the pilot can remain on wet so long as they are actively trying to cool the engines. That's why in these clips there are moments when oil temps are flashing. That's okay, I'm trying to fly in a way that's most realistic to any random player, not in the way that's most accurate for the perfect study. That way this study is more realistic at the cost of being 100% scientific. I think what really kills the run for the Yak 3 and what stops it from performing any higher in the list is how quickly it overheats. Don't get me wrong, it takes a while, at least in comparison to Italian planes. However, its engine does really overheat far before the Bearcat, forcing me to start opening up its cowl flaps and exhaust system, thus adding a whole bunch of undue drag to the aircraft. The Bearcat also has cowl flaps, but they aren't nearly as big for being just as efficient. This can be seen around the 4th hairpin turnaround Hagen on the map. The map, by the way, is following a previous Tempest run, kinder behind it by about a second, but frankly I think that's okay. The final third of the race, the river finally straightens out and starts to have more gentle turns. Great for the Tempest and Bearcat, who can finally put that power to good use, accelerating to their high top speeds, but detrimental to the Yak, who has a relatively low top speed in comparison. Another rule in my study is to disobey the engine overheating rule only after passing the final bridge, in an effort to make things more realistic rather than 100% scientific. No player I've ever raced, when they see the end of the race coming up, will think to themselves, I should really stop my engine from overheating. No, pedal to the metal, baby, ha. So with that in mind, I lay on the wet, pulled back any cowl flaps and accelerate as fast as I can, as any other player would. Never in my days have I ever seen someone use a Tempest. When a player does decide to use a British aircraft, it's either a Spitfire Mark 24 is the most common, but I've seen Seafire 47 before, or the Sea Fury. But there's something those aircraft are sorely lacking. Or rather, I think there's a secret recipe that makes for a good race plane. Looking at the top 10 aircraft, all of them, except for Russian aircraft, can carry about 2,000 pounds of bombs, meaning that these aircraft were made with mission flexibility in mind, and in turn their airframe design had at least some low-altitude efficiency and power. Aircraft that were specifically made to be interceptors like the TAR-152 or the Ki-83 do not have the same design goals in mind when those aircraft were developed. Furthermore, all top 10 aircraft had more time to cook. Tempest Mark II was re-engined to what's represented in the game by December 1944. F8 F1 wasn't put into service until May 1945. Yak 3 re-engineered into the Yak 3U wasn't finished until after the war. P-51H only saw service in Korea. Hornet Mark III introduced in 1946. F8 F1B see previous comment. F4U 7 similar in design and production to the U-1 produced in 1952. F7 F1 introduced into service in late 1944. F2G were one only a few, made in 1945. L9 prototype was completed and started service in 1946. I hope it's clear what I'm getting at here. The best race planes are not only those made with low-altitude flexible missions in mind, but they were all made either super late into World War II or are post-war aircraft. The same could not be said about Axis aircraft, who were struggling for resources and time to get any aircraft made at all, let alone the fastest, most powerful aircraft to match Allied power. I'm not going to go over the next 10 aircraft, but they all share similar problems. They are either not designed for low-altitude performance or were forced into production too soon and without the proper time to fine-tune design. Looking at the bottom of either list, I see something that I thought was absolutely tragic. While I was still collecting data in public lobbies, players would ask, "Well, how do you think this thing would do?" Or, "I'd love to see this plane tested. I think it will do well." Or, "This plane is known for its speed and performance. I would love to see how good it is." What were they talking about?
Who's that Pokemon?
It's Pikachu!
It's Clefairy!
I even bought the super fancy schmancy race livery for the G56, only to be utterly devastated by their race performance. When I think of what it means to be Italian designed, I think fast, sleek design, built for performance. You know car brands like Ferrari. But oh no, only 4 Italian planes were tested, and of those 4, only 2 could really be considered super props. Italian planes, despite using German engines, do not suffer from what I'm dubbing German engine syndrome, i.e. on max prop pitch all German engines explode before taking off. So Italian aircraft can make use of all of that raw German horsepower, but oh no, they all have terrible overheating problems, and I think that's truly what holds them back from being any better. The 109G2 and RE 2005 are a great example of this. They both used the same engine. The 109G2 suffers from German engine syndrome, whereas the 2005 does not. The 109G2 can keep its engine cooler for longer with MEC, thus it is able to shave off some time easily despite being unable to use full prop pitch. Also down here, in last place, are Swedish planes, specifically the J2101 at second to last and the B18B at absolute last. Now, I'm fully aware these are not even close to being super props. I would never use these planes to race even at their own battle rating. These planes were only included to help fill out the bigger picture. Furthermore, these planes also use German engines and do not suffer from German engine syndrome. They share the same engine with the Bf110G4. Other results that shocked me. I thought the I-225 could potentially be a great racer considering it has decent acceleration and terrible compression. So in turn, I would use its terrible compression as an advantage. It would bleed less speed in turns. However, this plane, because of its horrible compression, could not take advantage of the most efficient race line. In some cases, it would even overrun a corner, and I would throw away the lap because of it. The P63 blew me away. I was not at all prepared for how well it would perform. I've used the P63 in 4.0 races before, and it was always a super strong contender. So I'm glad to include it here. Airacobra pilots would agree with me saying it has very good top end acceleration and very good top speed. The recipe for a cracked racer. The only thing it struggles with is energy retention. It can take sharp corners, but bleeds too much energy to be any more competitive than it already is. Another thing that shocked me was the difference between MEC and AEC times on the P47M. When I initially put this in the study, I incorrectly assumed that later variation meant better performance. While this is true for something like a Mustang or 109 or a Spitfire, it was inherently untrue for the P47. Nevertheless, I learned that under AEC conditions the P47 is slow, not because of its overheating problems. On the contrary, actually, under AEC, the P47 can WEP the entire race without an overheating penalty. This is because its cowl flaps are completely wide open for the entire race, so any good pilot could easily fine-tune that. For the entire race, I pulled the flaps completely down, and only when the temperature numbers went red did I open things up to 10% both oil and radiator cooling. The numbers would go back down, but over time they would go back to red. So of course I just increased another 10%. By the last bridge, I was only ever at a max of 40%, thus saving me from immense drag penalties. I was hoping I would get a similar result on the P47D, but the AEC actually does a much better job. It only opens the cowl flaps when the engine is fully overheating, forcing the pilot to let go of WEP. However, even still, this can be improved on instead of waiting for the engine to overheat. Then, letting go of WEP and opening cowl flaps, the pilot could just do the same incremental cooling strategy as listed for the P47M. A major portion of this study was less about seeing what piston props were the best or the play between them, but rather is MEC worth it? Did you actually know what MEC was before watching this video? I know for a fact most players did not. For my entire tenure on this game, I've only been loosely familiar with the concept, but I've never actually taken the time to learn. For people who want a much more in-depth look at MEC, I'll include some links in the description for where I learned MEC. This study only looks at MEC in one controlled environment and should be treated as such. Is MEC worth it for racing? Yes. Buy an Asterisk. Well, there's actually some aircraft that performed worse with MEC. How could that be? On some aircraft, my example will be the LN9, the engine takes a very long time to overheat in general. AEC does a good job and actually keeps the cowl and radiator flaps tucked in on the LN9, so booming down the river not only does the LN9 get to hold WEP for a long period, it's also doing so with the least aerodynamic penalties. Only when the engine finally overheats in the last final stretches of the race is the pilot forced to pull off of WEP. Then the engine cools itself in 3 seconds, and the pilot can resume using WEP for another fairly long time. This is the best case scenario for AEC. Furthermore, it cannot be improved upon with MEC even if prop pitch and mixture control are available. As stated much earlier, there is a relationship between prop pitch and engine temperature. My example for that portion of this study were German planes, as it definitely matters most there. But it also affects these aircraft that performed better with AEC rather than MEC, because the LA9's engine is working harder to maintain RPM while still running at 100% prop pitch. It's going to overheat slightly faster, causing the pilot to either control the temperatures with cooling equipment and therefore drag or pull off of WEP and lose out on a significant portion of their total engine performance. It's once again a balancing act between engine performance and temperature. Perhaps a better pilot than me could make use of MEC on the LAT-9 and get a result in line with the rest of the study. Questions: engine performance with temperature. When using AEC, some planes, like Corsairs or Thunderbolts, can WEP without penalty for the entire race. This is because their cowl flaps are open the entire time WEP is applied. While this is great for max engine performance, this is terrible for aerodynamic efficiency. The extra drag created by the cowl flaps is too much for the WEP to overcome, and its top speed and acceleration is hampered drastically. So by using MEC and increasing engine temperatures, however not to a dangerous level, I can fly the Corsair or Thunderbolt far, far faster than an average player can. Why some variants and not others? I did not want this study to take me months to put together. The variants represented in this study are either the highest horsepower of a given airframe or the lightest. I also made sure to include the most common race planes I've personally seen before I conducted this study. So at the bare minimum, players who like racing those planes can see where their favorite aircraft falls in the list. Why no Chinese or Israeli representation in the chart? I have not researched any aircraft in those two nations. The only aircraft I have interest in testing is the LA-11, but that has less power than the LA-9, so why bother? Everything else in either tree is a copy-paste from a different nation. Why are some event or premium-only planes in the chart? I made sure the spreadsheet included all race planes and super props I had access to, even if that means other players wouldn't normally have access to them. There are still some props I wish I had so I could include them in the list. Things like the F7, F3, or A1H that are just up-engined versions of planes that already exist in the tech tree, or the J6K1, as it looks like it could potentially be a great racer. Why is the Wyvern included but not the A2D? I have the Wyvern, but I don't have the A2D. Furthermore, this is a study into piston propeller aircraft, so these turboprops would actually be barred from racing in a typical competition. I know for a fact the A2D destroys all piston prop competition. If you are here reading this looking for an answer to the fastest prop in the game, it's the A2D1, without a doubt. However, that's not nearly as interesting an answer. As for why the Wyvern is still included, I was just interested in seeing how it would perform. I have seen players use it in racing before, however, it never won. All asterisk piston props in this study have variable pitch propellers. The only aircraft in this study to not have a variable pitch propeller was the P-63, and I can't find any explanation as to why. For Messerschmitts, they were set to 50%, and for Focke-Wulfs, they could asterisk be set to 60%. On all SW airframes, that includes char, the aircraft can actually take off on a much higher prop pitch percent, but as the aircraft begins to pick up speed, and once it's nearing its top speed, the prop pitch percent must come down or the engine will explode, finally settling at 60% with high MAX engine RPM flashing on screen. But no damage occurred in my testing. Only when passing the final bridge are players allowed to ignore engine temperature cooling restrictions. Asterisk. I found in my testing that no engine will just overheat and die in the time it takes to get from the final bridge to the map border. So in order to get a faster time, I in EAT tests would ignore engine temperature and lay on the wet even if my engine was actively dying in order to get a faster race time. In MEC tests, I would pull back cowl flaps and other cooling equipment at the cost of temperature. In all fairness, this is typically how players race anyways, so this is actually the most realistic part of the whole study. Is MEC worth it for racing? Yes. Asterisk. This was sort of answered before this section, but I would just like to reiterate that yes, using MEC can get you a better, faster race time compared to the same plane using AEC.